My name is Abigail, and for a fleeting moment, I believed that the wedding aisle would be a pathway to a new happy life. A simple woman with an 8-year-old son Tim from my previous marriage, I had dreams like anyone else: love, companionship, and a stable family. Tim was skeptical about changes, but he'd warmed up to Henry, my new husband, quickly enough. We were small, imperfect, but content. That is, until Clara happened. The wedding was a grand affair. Clara, as the mother of the groom, had somehow assumed the role of a wedding planner with dictatorial powers. The venue, the flowers, and even my gown. She had something to say about everything. The more she micromanaged, the more I felt like an outsider at my own wedding. "Abby, don't you think you should reconsider that dress?" She scoffed as I tried on my bridal gown. "Actually, I really love this dress," I defended, hoping Henry would step in. "That's just how she is, Abby," Henry mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "She means well." The night before the wedding, as we were setting up, Clara berated the florist for the choice of roses. "Don't you have something more exotic? These are just so common, much like Abby's taste," she criticized. This time, I couldn't contain myself. Clara looked at me as if I were an irritating fly she couldn't swat away. "My son deserves the best, and if you can't provide it, then someone has to," she declared. Henry was right there, but he said nothing, just sighed, giving me a look as if to say, "What can we do?" The final straw came during the wedding reception. Tim, nervous but excited, had prepared a small speech. As he stood up to speak, Clara loudly whispered, "Oh God, what is the child going to babble about?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. I looked at Henry, waiting for him to defend our new family, but he did nothing as Tim nervously read his heartfelt speech. It was then that I realized I had made a monumental mistake. I was now tied to a man who would never stand up for me, and worse, to a woman who would forever undermine me. That night, as I slipped into my wedding bed, Henry sensed my unhappiness, but dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "You know how mothers are, Abby. Give it time," he said. "Time for what? For her to completely belittle me? For you to finally stand up for your wife?" I replied, but Henry sighed. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Sleep, okay. Tomorrow is a new day." Yes, a new day, the first in a series of miserable days that were to come. But back then, I didn't know that. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, pondering the gravity of the vows we just made, vows that already felt broken. After the chaos of the wedding, I foolishly thought that life would settle into some semblance of normalcy. Henry moved into the home that Tim and I had made for ourselves over the years. This had been a joyous period, a honeymoon phase filled with new beginnings. But Clara's influence was as invasive as ivy creeping through the cracks and choking the life out of our new family. The first visit happened just a week after our wedding. It was a Sunday, and I was busy making a family dinner, something to celebrate our first week as a married couple. The menu was classic comfort food: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables. I was just setting the table when Clara breezed into our home like an unexpected cold front. "Oh my, what an interesting spread," she declared, as if she were a judge on some kind of culinary TV show. Her eyes roved dismissively over the dishes on the table. "I thought it would be nice to have a home-cooked meal for our first Sunday dinner together," I explained, trying to hide my annoyance. "That might be what you're accustomed to, but Henry was raised with more sophisticated tastes," Clara countered, twisting her lips into a sly smile. Henry, who had been conspicuously silent, suddenly found his voice. "Mom, Abby worked hard on this. Let's just enjoy the meal," he said. But his words lacked force or conviction. Was this an ally or another passive observer in my life? I couldn't help but wonder. We sat down for dinner, but Clara's eyes didn't miss a thing. She commented on how the living room could use a woman's touch, hinting at its inadequacy. She criticized the way Tim held his fork, offering to enroll him in etiquette classes. And when I finally brought out my homemade apple pie, a family recipe passed down from my grandmother, she took one bite and said, Oh dear, did you mistake salt for sugar? The air was so thick with tension, you could slice it with a knife. Tim appeared increasingly uneasy, shrinking in his seat like a violet. Henry silently consumed his meal, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Clara, you've made your points. Is there anything you actually like about this place? Or are you just here to make us feel unwelcome in our own home? I finally burst out, unable to contain myself any longer. Clara looked at me with feigned surprise, as if she had been offering constructive criticism all along. I'm just trying to help you be a better fit for my son. Henry's voice finally interjected, albeit weakly. Mom, let's keep the criticism down, okay? He continued. But I'm just saying, Clara began, only to be interrupted by Henry. No, Mom, enough, he asserted, but the lack of force in his words made them almost meaningless. Clara pursed her lips and went quiet, but the damage was done. We finished our meal in silence, each bite tasting like sawdust. When Clara finally left the house, it felt like a battleground after a war, scarred and void of life. That night, as I cleaned up the kitchen, I wondered how many more of these family dinners I could endure. Tim, who had retreated to his room right after dessert, was the silent victim in all of this. And Henry, he was becoming more of a mystery each day, a man torn between two worlds, neither of which he was willing to fully inhabit. Henry came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. She'll get better, Abby. You'll see, he reassured me. I wanted to believe him, but as I looked around my own home, a place that had once been my son's sanctuary, but now felt like hostile territory, I couldn't help but wonder. Would we ever truly be a family, or were we doomed to live in the shadow of a woman hell-bent on keeping us apart? By the time winter rolled in, the tension in our home had reached its boiling point. Every visit from Clara turned into a grueling ordeal, each insult cutting deeper than the last. Tim had become increasingly withdrawn, and even Henry seemed to sense that things were unraveling. However, instead of confronting his mother, Henry suggested that I make more effort to get along with her. I don't know how much more I can take, Henry, I said to him one evening as we lay in bed. Your mother treats this house like it's her kingdom, and we are merely her subjects. Henry rolled onto his side to face me. She's a strong personality, sure, but she's also my mother, Abby. Can't you try to see the good in her? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Henry about a car ride the next evening. Just the girls, Tim, and me to clear the air. I looked at Henry puzzled. Your mother wants to go for a car ride to clear the air. What do you think she's up to? I asked. I don't know, Abby, but maybe it's a good sign. Maybe she's trying to make amends, he suggested, ever the optimist where his mother was concerned. My gut told me to decline the invitation, but against my better judgment, I agreed. What was the worst that could happen? I thought. Little did I know, I was walking straight into a trap. The next evening, we bundled up and climbed into Clara's luxury SUV. Tim sat in the back, his face lit by the glow of his handheld gaming device, clearly wanting to be anywhere else but there. I rode shotgun nervously, fiddling with my seat belt as Clara drove. So, where are we going? I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. Just a little drive around town. It's good to talk in a neutral setting, Clara replied, her eyes focused on the road. Neutral since when is your car neutral? I thought to myself. But I said nothing, hoping for the best. A half hour into the drive, Clara finally broke the silence. Abigail, I've been doing some thinking, and it's become painfully obvious that you're out of your depth here, she declared. Excuse me? I replied, stunned by the directness of her insult. You heard me. You're a divorcee with a child, trying to fit into a life you know nothing about. Henry deserves a woman who can actually add something valuable to his life, she continued, her words landing like a heavy blow. The audacity of her words left me breathless. I looked at Tim through the rearview mirror. He had removed his headphones and was listening intently, concern filling his young eyes. Clara, you've got it all wrong. I love Henry, and he loves me, and Tim is a part of that package, I asserted, my voice trembling with emotion. Love? What you call love, I call settling, she retorted, pulling the car to the side of the road near a stretch of deserted land. I think it's time for you and Tim to get out and think about what you've done to my family. You can't be serious. It's freezing out there, I protested. Very serious. Now get out, she commanded, her voice steely. I glanced at Tim, his face a mixture of confusion and fear, and I knew I had to protect him. As we stepped out into the cold, Clara sped off, leaving us stranded miles from home. We started walking, our steps heavy, each footfall a painful reminder of the trap we had just walked into. But with each step, I also felt a new resolve forming inside me. Clara had overplayed her hand this time, and I was ready to finally end this game. The moment the car's taillights disappeared into the distance, the gravity of our situation sank in. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, under a moonless sky with temperatures plummeting. I looked down at Tim. His eyes were wide, a mix of fear and disbelief clouding his young face. Mom, why did Grandma do that? Tim's voice wavered as he spoke, his breath visible in the icy air. I don't know, baby, but we're going to be okay. I promise, I said, mustering as much strength as I could. I took out my phone. No signal, of course. Clara had chosen a place far removed from civilization for her cruel scheme. Which way is home? Tim asked, shivering. We're too far from our house. But my parents live about 8 kilometers that way, I said, pointing down the road that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walk was excruciating. With each step, the cold seemed to pierce deeper into our bones. We were not dressed for this kind of weather, not prepared for this brutal test of endurance. A couple of times, Tim stumbled, and each time he did, my heart sank. I couldn't help but think of the irreparable damage Clara was causing, not just between her and me, but between her and her own grandson. Halfway through, Tim's complaints about his cold hands grew more urgent. My fingers hurt, Mom, he said, his voice trembling. I tried rubbing them, blowing on them, doing anything I could to bring some warmth back into his tiny red hands, but I knew we were in a bad situation that was getting worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the distant lights of my parents' home flickered on the horizon like a beacon in the dark. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but as we reached the doorstep, and I looked down at Tim's hands, my heart sank. His fingers were an alarming shade of white. Mom, Dad, we need help, I screamed as I banged on their front door. Within seconds, they were there, rushing us inside. My mother gasped when she saw Tim's hands, and my father immediately started the car to take us to the hospital. Before we left, I grabbed my phone, finally back in signal range, and dialed Clara's number. You've gone too far this time, I hissed into the phone when she picked up. Tim has frostbite because of you. I'm taking this to the authorities. There was a momentary pause on the other end. You wouldn't dare. Oh, I would, and I will. This ends now, I replied, hanging up. As we drove to the hospital, my father at the wheel, my mother comforting Tim in the back seat, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that we had escaped a potentially deadly situation, anger at Clara for what she had done, but most of all, a newfound determination. Clara had unleashed something in me that she hadn't anticipated. She wanted to break me, but instead, she had fortified my resolve to put an end to her reign of terror once and for all. The sterile smell of the hospital was as unnerving as always, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of urgency and dread. Tim was rushed into the emergency room, where the medical staff immediately started treating his frostbitten hands. My parents sat with me in the waiting area, their faces etched with concern and anger. Abigail, are you gonna let this go? You can't let Clara get away with this, my father urged, his voice tinged with disbelief. No, Dad, I won't let her get away with it. I've already called a lawyer. We're going to sue her, I said, my voice filled with newfound determination. I looked at my mom. Her eyes were filled with worry. Pride, good for you, honey. No one has the right to treat you or Tim like this, not even family, she said. My phone buzzed. It was Henry. Addie, my mom called me, said you're making threats. What's going on? The threats, as you call them, are promises, Henry. Your mother left Tim and me in the middle of nowhere in freezing temperatures. Tim has frostbite. We're in the hospital, I replied, my voice quivering with a mix of fear and anger. There was silence on the other end. I can't believe she would do something like that. I'm coming to the hospital. Don't bother, I snapped, cutting the call. Minutes turned to hours, but finally a doctor emerged from the ER. Your son is stable now. We've managed to treat the frostbite, but he'll need ongoing care and physical therapy. There might be long-term damage. I felt a range of emotions, relief that Tim was okay, but also a smoldering rage towards Clara for causing this agony in the first place. This was the turning point. There was no going back. When we returned home, my lawyer called. We've got a strong case, Abigail. We can not only sue for emotional distress, but also for child endangerment. Let's do it. Let's make sure she can never harm anyone again, I said, resolved. Later that night, Clara called. Her voice trembled. Abigail, can we talk? No, Clara, we can't. Your time for talking is over. See you in court. After hanging up, I felt neither satisfaction nor victory. Those emotions would perhaps never come in a situation as ugly as this. But what I did feel was empowerment. For the first time, I was taking control of my life, standing up against the tyranny that Clara had imposed on us for so long. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal battles and probably a divorce, but one thing was clear. I was no longer the woman who would be pushed into the corner, who would be silenced and mistreated. This was my turning point, and from here on, there would be no looking back. The courtroom was a whirlpool of tension, but as I sat there awaiting the verdict, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Across from me, Clara looked visibly distressed, her eyes darting between her lawyer and the judge. Henry was there too, but we hardly exchanged glances. We had become strangers bound only by the impending legal outcomes. Does the prosecution have any closing statements? The judge inquired, his eyes scanning the room. My lawyer rose from his seat. Your Honor, the evidence and testimonies clearly demonstrate that Mrs. Clara Edwards knowingly and intentionally endangered the lives of Abigail and her son Tim. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a calculated act of cruelty that could have resulted in a far greater tragedy. The room fell silent as the judge turned to Clara's defense attorney. Your Honor, he began, struggling to make eye contact. Mrs. Edwards deeply regrets the emotional strain she's caused her family, but she insists her actions were not intended to bring physical harm. That's irrelevant, the judge interrupted. Intention to harm or not, harm was done. The evidence is clear. As the judge retreated to his chamber for the final verdict, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. It was a message from Henry. Are you happy now? I looked up and caught his eye. Am I happy? My son could have suffered irreparable harm. This isn't about happiness, it's about justice. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge returned. I've considered the evidence and testimonies carefully, he began, shuffling his papers. It is the court's decision that Mrs. Clara Edwards is guilty on counts of child endangerment and emotional distress. She is hereby sentenced to 2 years in a federal prison. The room seemed to both tense up and exhale at the same time, as if everyone had been holding their breath. Clara's face turned a shade paler, her eyes widening in disbelief. Henry looked lost, but at that moment, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. As people started filing out of the courtroom, Clara approached me, tears streaming down her face. Abigail, can you ever forgive me? She asked. I think you should be asking Tim for forgiveness, not me, I replied coldly. But even if he forgives you, things will never be the same. You've lost not just a daughter-in-law, but a grandson too. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. This was not a happy ending. Too much pain had been inflicted for happiness to have a place here. But it was a just ending, one that held the promise of new beginnings. That evening, I sat down with Tim and explained that his grandma Clara would be going away for a while. Why, Mom? He asked, his eyes full of questions. I didn't have simple answers to that. Sometimes people make very bad choices, and they have to face the consequences, I said, pulling him into a hug. As I held him, I knew that the most challenging part of our journey was behind us. It was time to rebuild and move forward, not just as survivors, but as warriors who have faced down their demons and emerged stronger on the other side. And so we did. I filed for divorce, focused on Tim's recovery, and took time to heal. No, things would never go back to the way they were, but they could certainly get better. And in that promise of better, I found my revenge, my justice, and my peace.